Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video and possibly in a few subsequent videos, I'd like to talk a little bit about the JFK assassination. Okay, I think it's a very important case because I think it does combine both true crime, a little bit of politics, and also cluster B. Okay, I'll explain over the course of my argument why I think that I think it is likely that Lee Harvey Oswald was at least the gunman. Okay, I'm not saying he's the only one responsible, but at least the sole gunman. And I think it's pretty fair if you look at Lee Harvey Oswald's history. Okay, he had, I believe, severe cluster B personality pathology. Okay, I don't see any sign that he was actually psychotic or, let's say, schizophrenic. Um, but I do think that his pathology and his behavior is consistent with basically narcissism. I mean, he probably does have a combination of antisocial ASPD and NPD, but I think this is one of those rare cases where I see somebody right in the box, and I think he really does have like a lot of the features of actual pure NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so this is definitely a case that brings together sort of the cluster B issues that I talk about in this channel, and also the true crime, and even a little bit of the politics. Okay, so um, I am sympathetic to people who have trouble swallowing the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination, and that's only because I think there was a lot of reason why in the early '60s I think the U.S. government wanted to be kind of careful about how transparent they were in this investigation, only because by bad luck, and I guess let's call it bad luck, the person who looks like they killed Kennedy was a former Marine Corps enlisted man, okay, who had a problematic separation from the Marine Corps, okay, and then ended up defecting from the U.S. and going to live in the Soviet Union, okay, and even worse, ends up marrying the daughter or the relative, close relative of apparently a KGB agent in the USSR. Okay, so there's just a lot of really embarrassing, whatever baggage, I guess, associated with who looks like they may have killed the president. And also, this guy was involved in all kinds of Marxist activities in the United States, and apparently was getting very, very sympathetic to Fidel Castro right around a time where Kennedy was having a lot of problems with Cuba. And it was just, let's say, a bad time. If all this was just coincidental, they were just very bad coincidences. And so there was I think, a lot of motive for the U.S. to be super careful about maybe not being as transparent as they could be, and maybe just trying to wrap up a very simple investigation. So I think people are right to feel frustrated. Okay, I think people are right to feel frustrated, and I sympathize with that. On the other hand, I think it's important for us to take seriously Lee Harvey Oswald's actual biography and his day-to-day realities, and to understand how people saw him. Okay, and it's because I think when we look carefully at Lee Harvey Oswald's background, and if we're fair about it, we see a person who is not just carrying, let's say, a cluster B personality disorder. Okay, it's not just that. It's that his cluster B pathology was so severe, so severe. He was so impaired that even people who did not know anything about psychology, they had the impression that he was mentally ill. Okay, that's how bad his personality pathology was. He really came across as being a totally flaky and mentally ill, and really, really just a mentally disturbed person, even to people who did not have a psychological background. Okay, so with that in the picture, I think we have to question whether there's a lot of reason why no government, not the United States, not Russia, and not even Cuba, would really want to work too closely with a person like that, because you can't really trust your secrets, and you can't really, to be a spy. If you're going to be a spy, if you're going to be an operative for, like, say, like a spy op kind of person, you have to at least be trustworthy. Okay, if they don't, if a country doesn't feel they can trust you with secrets, okay, you're not going to be very useful, and it'll be too dangerous to trust you with major, because at that time in the early '60s, one little mistake with espionage, one little mistake, and you could start World War III. Okay, the countries Russia, Cuba, the United States, they were very close to war at that time. Okay, so just the slightest little mistake, whatever, and you could really risk a World War III. Okay, so you have to wonder whether Russia or Cuba would be so negligent or be so stupid as to potentially do something so extreme that could risk, a World War III. Okay, and killing a president, I mean, that could cause a war. So I think we need to fairly doubt whether Russia would have said, "Oh yeah, let's just go ahead and knock off President Kennedy in public." I mean, in a gruesome spectacle. I mean, that is that's stupid. I mean, so you have to question that, and you also have to question whether even Cuba would have wanted that, or for it to happen that way. So given how crazy, honestly, how crazy Lee Harvey Oswald apparently was, okay, I have to question whether I think Cuba would have just been, oh yeah, sure, we trust this guy. Yeah, let's just let him do whatever he wants. Let's let him, take a rifle and just blow the president's head off in broad daylight, in a public place. I mean, I think I think even Fidel Castro probably would have been a little more subtle than that. Um, anyway, this is just my opinion. So we always have to consider the possibility, okay, that Lee Harvey Oswald really was just a very crazy, crazy person who may have done some crazy things, okay? And even if he had relations with the Cuban government, even if he did, I don't know that he necessarily was told to go up to the sixth floor and to shoot President Kennedy at that time in that way. Okay, I can't say that because we don't have any evidence of that. Okay, so even if he was, let's say, warming up to Cuba, and even if they were potentially talking to him, okay, we can't necessarily conclude that the way this murder was committed was actually the way that Cuba may have wanted it to, or whether they even knew about it. Okay, so let's just leave those things as separate. It's possible that Lee Harvey Oswald was making serious attempts to communicate with Cuba and maybe to try to go live in Cuba. Okay, fine. But let's not necessarily conclude that everything that he did was with under the instruction or the approval of the Cuban government. We don't know that. Okay, and I mean, we just have to be honest. On the other hand, I share the frustration that the Warren Commission was, it didn't necessarily give the feeling that it was a fully transparent and a fully competent investigation. So I understand that, but both things can be true. It can still be a bad investigation, and at the same time, maybe some of their conclusions may just happen to be correct. Okay, so that's just the frustration of, that's just the frustration of real life investigation. There may be flaws in the investigation, and yet some of the conclusions may make sense. As far as actually analyzing, how many shooters were involved, okay, I'm sympathetic. I understand that there was a very chaotic scene, and I know the people near the scene of the crime, they heard gunshots from different directions. Okay, now that may possibly be explained because the sounds of a rifle can echo, especially if there's a lot of buildings around the plaza. So there may be some confusion as to the direction of the sound. Okay, I understand that. And also, as we analyze the Zapruder film, and as we analyze, just what people have said about the actual impacts of the bullets, there could be, I guess, room to debate, from what direction these bullets came and all that. The first thing I want to address is actually the so-called magic bullet theory, and the idea that the bullet could come from above and basically hit Kennedy basically in the back of the neck, okay, and go right through the soft tissue of the neck, not hitting any bone, which did not hit any bone. We know that. They actually had the entrance wound in the back of his neck, and there was no bone affected, as the bullet exited from the front. And then the question is, could it have hit Connolly in the torso and then hit Connolly in the arm and in the leg? Okay, now it just depends on how they're seated in the limo. Okay, basically Kennedy's in the back, right? So it just depends. Was Kennedy more to the outside or was he more to the inside? Okay, now I think the Warren Commission has Kennedy to the outside, but the bullet coming from the far right. Okay, now the way I saw the trajectory, I saw Kennedy more from the inside of the limo, with the bullet coming a little bit from, like, say, the center to the right. Okay, so basically, it just depends on how Kennedy was lined up with Connolly. Okay, and if Kennedy was just a little to the inside, Connolly's just a little to the outside, then a bullet coming from the top down going through the neck area, okay, that could be a sort of a straight line, and depending on how Connolly is seated, okay, seated in the car, the bullet could come through Connolly's torso and basically hit his arm and his leg at the same time without really changing its direction. Okay, so I think that pretty much gets answered. The question of the magic bullet, it's just a question of analyzing how they were seated together. Okay, and just common sense. So yeah, I do agree. If you don't understand the lineup on how Kennedy and Connolly were seated, then it could be a conflict, as to the direction of the bullet, and maybe it would be impossible to hit them both in the way it did. But if they were lined up properly, depending on how they were seated in the car, that could actually explain how the bullet could hit both of them. And if the bullet went through Kennedy and did not hit any bone, that bullet left him at a very high speed. And so that high speed bullet's going to hit what you're going to continue hitting whatever. And if Connolly's right in front, it is conceivable that it could go through Connolly as well. So, I don't see that as a big mystery. Now, recently there's a Secret Service agent who, like, at his deathbed confession very recently, or, late in life, has said that he actually interfered with evidence, and he found a bullet in the limo and he put it on the stretcher next to Connolly in the hospital. Okay. Well, that could be the very same bullet. You know what I mean? That could either be that bullet, or it could be the bullet that missed. Because apparently there was one shot that just missed. I don't know the answer to that. But the bottom line is that, I don't really see that as a big revelation. That could actually be the same bullet that the medical staff found on the stretcher next to Connolly. And maybe the Secret Service agent just was very dishonest about how he just put it there without explaining to anybody or without telling anybody, But I don't think that really destroys the case or really creates a big problem. Now, as far as the headshot, okay, I know that it's hard to watch that shot. Okay, and I also know that the physics of being shot in the head is very gruesome. Okay, and it's also kind of counterintuitive, because your skull, basically, it depends on how fast the rifle bullet is going, but the skull is basically just a shell with a lot of liquid on the inside. Okay. And so if the bullet penetrates fast enough, okay, basically it just slices right through the skull and doesn't really impact the skull. It drills through the skull. It doesn't pound the skull. You see what I mean? So it's not like getting hit on the back of the head by a flat object. So it's not going to force your head forward. It just penetrates the skull. And if anything, it showers a bunch of brain matter forward, which in a sense could almost produce a thrust vector to have the head go back slightly. Okay, so there have been numerous ballistics tests done on simulations of cranium, cranium simulating the head and the brain matter, where they've done the shot from the top top left going to the right, and basically the brain and the head basically reacted very similar to how we see in the video. Okay, and also it's consistent with a rear shot to have sort of like this spray of pink matter, like a pink cloud, like going forward. Okay, so when you can see the impact in the Zapruder film, what you see is this big pink cloud in the front, but that pink cloud in the front is actually the spray from the bullet hitting in the back and throwing all the brain matter forward. Okay, and then you see the flap of the skull coming, separating, but that's consistent with a rear shot opening up the skull to the side. And I think, forensic pathologists have looked at the x-rays and have looked at the autopsy photos and have seen that that's consistent with a penetration in the very back and sort of opening up the skull in the front with a big spray of pink blood and brain matter instantly, at the moment of impact. So I when I look at the shot, the headshot, it does to me look like a rear shot. And then finally, people say the autopsy photos were doctored, but I say it would be very hard to doctor so well, or to fake an entrance wound so well, because you can see the entrance wound in the very back of the head, okay? And it's just a perfect circle, it's a perfect entrance wound, and it's fully consistent with the exit at sort of the front side of the brain. So I know people say you could doctor the autopsy photos. I know people say you could manipulate the corpse, but I mean, to get that good of an entrance wound looking so perfect, I would say the greater probability is that the entrance wound really was at the back of the head. And, the only question then is, why is it that these very, very credible emergency room surgical residents and surgical physicians who attended President Kennedy in the emergency room, why is it that at least one of them has said very clearly that he recalls a massive exit wound at the back of the head, okay, that he thought was consistent with an entrance wound, let's say in the throat or something, however he wanted to say that. Um, well, I think we have to understand that that's somebody who examined Kennedy just visually. He did not see the X-rays. Okay. And I think that when you get a visual impression of somebody, okay, let's remember Kennedy's head opened up at the side, okay? And it was kind of like a big wound at the side. Now, depending on how his head was rotated as he was sitting on the stretcher, okay, it may have sort of looked at first glance like it was a rear opening, okay? And maybe, in the emotion of the moment, maybe the doctor just saw this gaping skull just completely open and just kind of in the grotesque moment just saw it as sort of just a rear opening. Okay. But if you took a closer look, maybe depending on how the head was tilted on the stretcher, but if you took a closer look, and you can even see in the Zapruder film, the head opens up actually on the side. Okay. The head does not open up at the back on the Zapruder film. So I think taking in the combination of the head x-rays, which show clearly the head opened up on the side, not at the back, and then the clear autopsy photo that shows the entrance room at the back. Okay. I think because the weight of the evidence really supports, and the Zapruder film is very clear. I think the weight of the evidence supports that the entrance was actually in the back, and that the doctor was just confused in the moment and thought he had perceived a big opening at the very back when it was really on the side. And so I think the greater weight of the evidence is that the bullet penetrated Kennedy's skull from the very back and opened up his skull at the side, okay, and basically just blew the whole brains, out of the skull. It's a miracle that Kennedy didn't die instantly. Okay, it's a miracle that there were some, like, say, the brain stem basically remained active, and that he didn't lose enough blood instantly, just by a miracle, because there's so many arteries in the brain. I guess that's the problem. He was hit sort of at the top of the brain. So if the bullet had hit him more at the center of the brain, he would have just been dead instantly, basically. It's just a miracle that his body continued sort of spontaneously breathing, and his heart continued beating just a little while as he got into the emergency room. To me, that's a miracle, because his brain was blown away, basically. And that was an absolutely lethal shot as far as I could tell. So, probably 9 times out of 10, a shot like that, he would have gotten to the hospital dead already. Okay. So it's just amazing that he even got to the emergency room. But I see it as a single shot to the head, from the back. And then I see a single shot, going through Kennedy's neck area and ending up hitting Connolly. I guess I see that as consistent with a single shooter. Okay. And so that's not to say that there weren't people influencing Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay. We cannot say for sure. Okay. I think it would have been very stupid for Cuba to actually tell him, yeah, this is a perfect opportunity for us, Cuba. You do that. You go ahead and shoot him at broad daylight in Dallas, and we'll just pretend we don't know each other, and we'll say we never heard of you, and you'll just do whatever. And I think Lee Harvey Oswald, that would have been pretty stupid. I don't know. I think that's kind of hard to imagine, and I guess, I don't know. Of course, it was stupid for Lee Harvey Oswald to do it by himself too. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking. I mean, I don't know. Well, but the bottom line is that, I guess Lee Harvey Oswald, his intent was that he was just going to kill Kennedy like that, spectacular, right? And then he was just going to disappear and maybe just get out of the country or whatever. I mean, that was probably his plan. So it would just be like an unsolved case, whatever. But I don't know. I mean, you're in the middle of a city where there's a president motorcade at the time. There's going to be huge police presence. If Lee Harvey Oswald thought that he could sneak out and disappear, at a time, when there's a president in the area, and the police, they probably got probably nobody was taking a day off on the police force. Probably all the police were were working that day. So for him to think that he could sort of sneak out of the downtown under those circumstances, that's pretty ballsy, I think, and probably not very good judgment. Anyway, but just looking at what people said about Lee Harvey Oswald, basically just his experience in the Marine Corps, just consistent all through his life. People thought he was a flake. People thought he was crazy. People thought he was mentally ill. I'm amazed actually that the Marine Corps didn't diagnose him as being mentally ill. And it's funny because he actually had a nervous breakdown while he was in the Marine Corps. That's amazing. I think maybe if he was in today's Marine Corps, I think he would have been discharged for psychologically disqualified. I think today, I think back then you could have a nervous breakdown and they would just keep you on, and just maybe put you on lighter duty or something. But in today's military, I think he would have been spotted early, and I think probably kicked out of the military. So, but in any case, people who knew Lee Harvey Oswald repeatedly thought that he was crazy. People that were interviewed from Russia, who actually talked about having known him in Russia, thought that he was crazy. Okay, so you could say, well, maybe he was acting crazy because that was part of his cover. He was actually smarter than a fox, whatever. I think more than likely because so many people, everybody who met him, just thought he was crazy because he was beating his wife in front of people and treating her so crappy. I think that really, to me, causes me to question whether they were these two very intelligent spies, and maybe the wife was also a spy, and all this was coordinated. And to me, it just seems a little far-fetched to think that they would pretend to have such a dysfunctional relationship and he'd just be beating her and getting her pregnant. And that just seems a little too elaborate. So I think, to me, the greater weight of the evidence is that, unfortunately, and this is very unfortunate, Lee Harvey Oswald was a person who had mental illness. And his mental illness was basically narcissistic personality disorder with some antisocial and maybe some other delusional, whatever, just unstable, immature, super immature. It's just a lot of issues, and also, violent. He had violent tendencies. The guy would beat his wife with very little provocation. And also, there were reports from the places that Lee Harvey Oswald worked, where the coworkers complained that Lee Harvey Oswald was very confrontational, very disagreeable, did not get along with people. When he had to walk around people, like say in hallways, he would bump into people, wouldn't like let people pass. He was very rude, very just people thought he was violent. People met him at dinner parties and they got the impression that he was a violent person just from talking to him. So this is somebody who had a lot of instability, a lot of cluster B pathology, a lot of basically narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial, but combined with a tendency to be erratic and violent. I don't think he's the kind of person that any government would want as part of their spy, to be like a spy or to be working as an agent for any country. So I think more than likely, I think he was probably just kind of at some point under delusions that he was influencing world politics, and that he just got this delusion that, like some people get, where they just want to kill people. Look at this guy recently, this MAGA guy who was arrested a few years ago in his van in Florida, who had been sending boxes with explosives to people like Nancy Pelosi and people like George Soros or whatever. This guy Caesar Sayoc in Florida, just a crazy guy. You'd really think the CIA would work with somebody like that? When people are that crazy, I think it's possible they're just acting alone. And I know it's very hard to accept. It's very uncomfortable and very just kind of is frustrating, because when you look at the pattern, when you look at how Lee Harvey Oswald was living his life, that pattern sort of makes you wonder if he was connected to Russia or connected to Cuba, or maybe connected to something in the United States. You have to wonder about that. But I just think because the guy was so unstable, because he was so unreliable and maybe just plain mentally ill, I think it's more likely, I think, that he just got these ideas that he wanted to kill people, basically. And I think maybe he had reasons to want independently to kill Kennedy, just because right around the time, right before the assassination, I think Fidel Castro had made some comments about Kennedy, really talking very badly about him. And I think maybe Lee Harvey Oswald saw an opportunity, and maybe also shared Castro's feelings towards Kennedy. And it was just a very unfortunate situation. But I personally believe that if you really just look at the autopsy photos, if you believe them, I mean, and if you compare that with the Zapruder film and also just the physics of how a bullet will penetrate from the back of a skull, basically, you know, I think everything is consistent pretty much with a single shooter from the rear. And, as far as the magic bullet, I think that's answered by just the way Kennedy's body was lined up with Connolly in the car. And I think it's probably your answer right there, that it was just the way they were positioned. And that would explain the so-called magic bullet. And yeah, so I guess I feel as though it's a single shooter, and I feel like this was basically the unfortunate result of mental illness. And also, I will say this: I think maybe the CIA and the FBI, whatever combination, okay, they were keeping tabs of Oswald when he got back from the USSR. Okay, the government was aware that he was a former Marine, that he had defected to the Soviet Union, and that he did come back because he was not happy in the Soviet Union. Okay, and he came back desperately to the United States after being in Russia. Okay, and so the FBI was watching him. Okay, and I think the CIA knew about him. Okay, so if there's a way that we can maybe attach some blame to the FBI or the CIA, maybe it's that they didn't take him seriously enough as a crazy person. Okay, and also, I think we should question whether the assassination attempt on General Edwin, I forget his last name, but there was like a general, a guy who was like the Steve Bannon of that time. I'm sorry, I forgot the name. Okay, it's a General Edwin. I'll remember it as soon as I stop this video. But basically, there was a former general who Kennedy had fired. Okay, or who was Kennedy basically got involved and got this guy separated from the army. He was a general, and he was kind of like the Steve Bannon, kind of like super right wing of that time. Okay, and Oswald hated that guy. Okay, so Oswald basically tried to kill him with the same rifle. All right, and he basically shot at him in his house, and the shrapnel of the bullet actually hit him, I think, in the arm. So he was almost killed. Oswald almost killed this guy. Okay, and so I think maybe we could also add some fault to the government, that maybe they could have investigated that shooting better. And it's too bad they didn't catch Oswald at that time and figure out that he was the one that had shot at that general in his house. Okay, because that happened months before the assassination of Kennedy. Okay, and so if you want to blame the government, I would say blame the government for not keeping better track of Oswald while he was in the U.S. Maybe underestimating him, and just kind of dropping the ball and not being more alert to how dangerous and how mentally unstable he was. So that part, that maybe could be. And also maybe the government did know that Oswald had gone to the Cuban embassy in Mexico. Okay, and maybe again, just it's embarrassing for us because it looks like we weren't taking him seriously enough, and then he goes and kills the president. So on that side, I can see that we should be dissatisfied by how the government handled this case, and in that sense, maybe we can hold the government responsible. But to say that either our government or another government was orchestrating the assassination, I don't see that. I don't really see that reflected in the best interpretation of the evidence. So, anyway, that's my interpretation of the assassination, and thanks for watching.